that anyone listening to this show realizes that this, in fact, is taking place in this country right now. This is why our politicians and so-called stewards of our government are not acting constitutionally and not acting within the law. Okay? Yes, it's money-driven, but it's also goal-oriented driven as well. Okay? Now you can see why vile Earl Warren and his equally vile co-Supreme Court justices issued that infamous and treasonous desegregation decision in 1954. It was to aid and abet the plot of the Illuminati conspirators to create tension and strife between the Negroes and whites. Can you see why the same Earl Warren issued his decision prohibiting Christian prayers and Christmas carols in our schools? Why Kennedy did likewise, and can you see why Johnson and 66 senators, despite the protests of 90% of the American people, voted for the Consular Treaty, which opens our entire country to Russian spies and saboteurs? All those 66 senators are the 20th century Benedict Arnolds. That's 66 of them in 1954. It is up to you and you, all the American people, to force Congress, our elected servants, to haul in those American traitors for impeachments, and that when proven guilty, they would be given the punishment prescribed for traitors who aid and abet our enemies. And that includes the enforcing of rigid investigations by Congress of the CFR and all their fronts, such as the ATL, the NAACP, the SNIC, and such Illuminati tools as Martin Luther King. Now, he is not an Illuminati tool, and I don't care what anybody says, and I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I believe Martin Luther King to be a great man, and I don't know where that statement is coming from, so I definitely disagree with that. Such investigations will completely unmask all the leaders in Washington, D.C. and the Illuminati and all their affiliations and affiliates as traitors carrying out the Illuminati plot. It will completely unmask the United Nations as the intended crux of the entire plot and force Congress to take the U.S. out of the UN and hurl the UN out of the U.S. In fact, it will destroy the UN and the entire plot. Before I close this phrase, I wish to reiterate and stress one vital point, which I urge you never to forget. If you wish to save our country for your children and their children, here is the point. Every unconstitutional and unlawful act committed by Woodrow Wilson, by Franklin Roosevelt, by Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and that are now being committed by Johnson and today George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, exactly in line with the Illuminati conspirators. Okay? Centuries-old plot outlined by Weishaupt and Albert Pike. Every vicious decision issued by the traitorous Earl Warren and his equally traitorous Supreme Court justices was directly in line with what the Illuminati blueprint required. That all the treason committed by our State Department under Rusk and earlier by John Foster Dulles and Marshall, also all the treason committed by McNamara and his predecessors directly in line with that same Illuminati blueprint for the takeover of the world. Also the amazing treason by various members of our Congress, especially the 66 senators who signed the Consular Treaty, has been committed on orders from the Illuminati. Now I will go back to Jacob Schiff's entrapment of our money system and the treasonous actions that followed. It will also reveal the Schiff-Rothschild control of not only Karl Marx, but of Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, who created the revolution in Russia and set up the Communist Party. It was in 1908 that Schiff decided that the time had come for his seizure of our money system. His chief tenants in that seizure were Colonel Edward Mandel House, whose entire career was that of chief executive and courier for Schiff, as I shall show you, and Bernard Baruch and Herbert Lehman in the fall or autumn of that year. They assembled in a secret conclave at the Jekyll Island Hunt Club, owned by J.P. Morgan at Jekyll Island, Georgia. Among those present were J.P. Morgan, John B. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Senator Nelson Aldrich, Schiff, Stillman, and Vanderleep of the New York National City Bank, W. and J. Seligman, Eugene Meyer, Bernard Baruch, Herbert Lehman, Paul Warburg. In short, all of the international bankers in America, all of them members of the hierarchy of the Illuminati's great conspiracy. A week later, they emerged with what the Federal Reserve System. Senator Aldrich was a stooge who was to railroad it through Congress, but they held that railroading in abeyance for one chief reason. They would first have to plant their man and obedient stooge in the White House to sign the Federal Reserve Act into law. They knew that even if the Senate would pass that act unanimously, the then newly elected President Taft would promptly veto it, so they waited. In 1912, their man Woodrow Wilson was elected to the presidency. Immediately after Wilson was inaugurated, Senator Aldrich railroaded the Federal Reserve Act through both houses of Congress, and Wilson promptly signed it, and the Federal Reserve Act became law. That heinous act of treason was committed on December 23rd, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when all the members of Congress, except for several carefully picked representatives and 3 equally carefully picked senators, were away from Washington. How heinous, treasonous was that act? I'll tell you. Our founding fathers knew full well the power of money. They knew that whoever had the power held the destiny of our nation in his hands. Therefore, they certainly guarded his power when they set forth in the Constitution that Congress, the elected representatives of the people alone, would have the power. The constitutional language on this point is brief, concise, and specific. Stated in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5, defining the duties and powers of Congress, and I quote, "To coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and of the standard of weights and measures, but on the tragic, unforgettable day of infamy, December 23rd, 1913, the men who set to Washington to safeguard our interests, the representative senators and Woodrow Wilson, delivered the destiny of our nation into the hands of aliens from Eastern Europe. Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg." Warburg was a very recent immigrant who came here on orders from Rothschild for the express purpose of blueprinting that foul Federal Reserve Act. Now the vast majority of the American people think the Federal Reserve System is a United States government-owned agency. That is positively false. All of the stock of the Federal Reserve banks is owned by the member banks, and the heads of the member banks are all members of the hierarchy of the great Illuminati conspiracy known as the CFR. The details of that act of treason, in which many traitorous so-called Americans participated, are far too long for this reporting. But all those details are available in a book entitled The Federal Reserve Conspiracy, written by Eustace Mullins. In that book, Mullins tells the entire horrifying story and backs it up with unquestionable documents. Aside from it being a truly fascinating and shocking story of the great betrayal, every American should read it as a matter of vital intelligence for the time when the whole American people will finally come awake and smash the entire conspiracy. With God's help, that awakening will surely come. God bless that day. Now, if you think that those aliens, and they are by accident of both American co-conspirators, would be content with just the control of our money system, you are in for another very sad shock. The Federal Reserve System gave the conspirators complete control of our money system